Hey everyone, Mr. Harvey here. Let's continue our lecture on Chapter 9, and we are continuing our conversation about the Enlightenment and about Enlightened Absolutism. Now, we talked previously in the previous lecture about the wars, War of Austrian Succession, Frederick the Great, and some of his reforms. I want to talk a little bit about some of the changes that we're going to be seeing within the Austrian Empire. Now, Maria Theresa, I want to talk a little bit about Maria Theresa because we've been talking about her since the Pragmatic Sanction, War of Austrian Succession, 7 Years' War, and I want to give a little bit of information on her. Now, she's not considered, and this is important, she is not considered one of our enlightened absolute monarchs, ladies and gentlemen. She wasn't truly influenced. There was some influence by the Enlightenment, but her son Joseph is really known for the changes that he makes within the Austrian Empire. But I do want to give you a little bit of information about Maria Theresa. Okay, now she's not considered an enlightened despot by most historians. Okay, she ruled for about 40 years, ladies and gentlemen, and as we know, she came to power through that pragmatic sanction of her father, Charles VI. And just to review, that pragmatic sanction is where the European powers agreed to, this was agreed to by the great European powers that the Habsburg Empire would remain intact under Maria Theresa. She was very conservative. She was very cautious. And she sought to improve the condition of her people through absolutism, not necessarily through the lens of the Enlightenment. Okay. And we know that in the War of Austrian Succession, which started off when she took over, she lost Silesia, but she was able to maintain her empire and her position of leadership within the empire. All right. Now, during her reign, there will be some changes. We're going to talk about her son a little bit later, a little bit after this. There's going to be massive changes under Joseph, but she made some really important changes as well. She's going to centralize her control over the Habsburg Empire. She's going to really try to go after the power of the nobles and reduce their power over their serfs. She's going to try to help out her serfs and peasants by reducing their feudal dues and tax the nobles. And she did a lot to try to help her serfs, ladies and gentlemen. And she did this really for economic and military motives, in a similar manner to Frederick the Great. Her son did a lot more to help the serfs in Austria, but Maria Theresa did have quite a bit of influence in helping out the serfs. Part of the reason why she was doing this was there was a terrible famine and disease within the empire, and she wanted to make sure that they did not rebel. And she also needed soldiers for her army. Remember, right when she gets into power, a war starts. Okay, and she's in major wars throughout a lot of her rule. And so her main motivation for helping these serfs is to help her, is to really make sure that her empire does not crumble with Prussia and with this War of Austrian Succession and with the 7 Years' War going off. She's also going to continue to consolidate control with the Catholic Church. She's going to consolidate control and consolidate the Catholic Church under state control, tax the church, reduce the Pope's influence in Austria, and promote a lot of economic development. And she believed that by helping the serfs, not just so they don't revolt and for her army, but she also believed that by helping the serfs, that could help equate to more production. If they're happier serfs, they have more freedom. Okay, that might equal more. They might be happier and more willing to work harder for the country in producing goods and crops agriculturally. She's going to abolish guilds, encourage immigration, support private business, improve transportation, abolish internal taxes. But she is not considered an enlightened despot, ladies and gentlemen. Her son Joseph is. Okay, so let's talk about Joseph. All right, he co-ruled with his mother for about 15 years, ladies and gentlemen. Ruled solo for about 10 more years, and he was a very humorless individual. He had a very cold personality. Wasn't very outgoing, not very personable. Slept on straw, and he was a very serious individual. He's considered the greatest of our enlightened despots, ladies and gentlemen. But in many ways, he's going to be among the least effective, and that's because his brother is going to reverse a lot of what he does. Okay, his brother is going to reverse a lot of what he does. He was a deeply deeply firm believer in absolutism, but also deeply influenced by the Enlightenment. Okay, so he's going to be a great example of this enlightened absolutism. All right, let's talk about what he does. All right, right off the bat, ladies and gentlemen, he is going to abolish serfdom in the Austrian Empire. Now, this is going to be reversed by his brother, but this is a major thing. He's going to completely abolish it. All right, so we saw Frederick the Great. He abolishes on crown lands. Joseph's taking that a step further, and he is abolishing it throughout his empire. Okay, he's going to give peasants numerous freedoms, and no, just the risk that Joseph's taking, ladies and gentlemen. We know this about the East. These monarchs need the nobles. You think nobles are happy with this? But he is doing this. Okay, he is doing this. All right, for a variety of reasons, which we'll get into. But he's granting the peasants freedoms, the right to marry, the right to engage in skilled work, the right to have children the right to have children learn a skill without the permission of a landlord. And he's not abolishing the authority of the nobles and landlords, but he's trying to moderate their authority. And what Joseph's goal is to reduce the traditional burdens on peasants, very similar to his mom, to make them more productive and industrious, but also in the spirit of the Enlightenment, more toleration towards people. Okay, very much in the spirit of the Enlightenment, more equality. Okay, let's continue to talk about what some of the things he does. Okay, and we'll see this. Joseph was a practicing Catholic, but because of the Enlightenment, he's going to favor a policy of toleration. Really important for us to remember, ladies and gentlemen, Joseph is a Habsburg. Okay, he comes from the Habsburg family. Really important for us to understand. His ancestors are Ferdinand II, Charles V. Okay, he comes from the same lineage of some of these really devout Catholics, and we see him promoting religious toleration to Protestants, Lutherans, Calvinists, Jews. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a major change for Austria. Okay, we're going to see these groups have the right to their own places of worship, to sponsor schools, to enter skilled trades. Now, some groups like the Jews aren't going to have full equality; they'll have private worship. But this is a major change for our Habsburg Catholic country, which has fought so hard to maintain that Catholicism. Joseph is making some changes. He's also going to bring the Catholic Church under his control even more than his mom. He's going to have bishops not talk to the Pope directly, but through him, close monasteries, put seminaries under government supervision, make the Roman Catholic priests, employees of the state as opposed to employees of the church. He is going to control the church and bring it under his control, as opposed to have more of a partnership with the church as some of the previous Habsburg rulers have had. We're seeing Joseph make some serious changes, ladies and gentlemen, serious changes. Okay? He's going to introduce some freedom of the press to an extent, reform the judicial system to make it more equal for all citizens, abolish torture and the death penalty, expand schools, establish more of a healthcare system, mental health with insane asylums, poorhouses, orphanages, major reforms. Joseph was very liberal, very much trying to make a huge impact upon how the Austrian Empire was run. He's also going to propose a new system of land taxation that if you own, rent, or work on land, that will be taxed. But then that's going to anger the nobles, and they block its implementation. And a lot of what Joseph reforms, with his brother Leopold, when Joseph is gone, he's going to repeal and reverse many of Joseph's reforms. But Joseph, ladies and gentlemen, really, embodying the Enlightenment, viewing this as a progressive opportunity to help his country develop, made some major reforms, ladies and gentlemen. But they will not last too long because his brother will reverse them. All right, let's finish off this lecture, ladies and gentlemen, talking a little bit about Catherine the Great, who is on the cover of your textbook. All right. She's considered one of the greatest rulers in European history, and as a reformer, she's probably the least enlightened of these enlightened despots because she's not going to make as many changes as Frederick or as Joseph. Okay, that's not to say that she's very effective and that she's very successful as a ruler. She is very, very much, but she is not going to be as influenced by the Enlightenment as some of the others. So she is considered, one of the more the least influenced by the Enlightenment of these enlightened despots. Okay. Now, after the death of Peter the Great, all right, there was a lot nobles and the army really had a big impact on who ruled, and therefore people of little talent really determined who ruled, all right. And Catherine, in her early years in Russia, lived in a lot of fear. She didn't really like it there. She was miserable there, and she's going to become queen after her husband, Peter III, is going to be assassinated during the 7 Years' War. And she actually approved of that assassination of her husband. All right. And so we are going to see she take over. Now, she's German, and so we're not going to see the crown be passed on a notion of hereditary of family, as Peter the Great had abolished that. So she's going to be taking over. Okay, Catherine the Great takes over. Let's continue. Now, Catherine the Great was influenced by the Enlightenment. She really liked French culture, and when it comes to the Enlightenment, ladies and gentlemen, she kind of had she was very moderate towards it. She considered herself a child of the Enlightenment, but in her policy, she's not going to enact much of the Enlightenment that we're going to see. She refused. She loved French culture, like I mentioned before. She refused to speak Russian or German in her court. She spoke French. Diderot lived in her court for a time. Voltaire came to visit her for a time, and so she's definitely going to be interested, in some of the Enlightenment, but she's not necessarily going to enact a lot of the politics and policies. Now, Catherine did know that Russia needed more reform and was behind. And we know that about Russia. Okay, we know that. Peter saw the same thing. Peter said, hey, if we go back to chapter 5, Peter the Great, Peter said there are so many changes that we need to make, and he tried to westernize and modernize, right? St. Petersburg, his Great Northern War, okay, changing the culture, changing the military, right? She saw the same thing, okay, and she, very smart, ladies and gentlemen, she convened and summoned a commission to reform and revise the law and help advise her on reforming, Russia socially, politically, and economically. And this really helped her also, ladies and gentlemen, and this really shows her intelligence and how intelligent Catherine was. This really helped her gain a pulse and a great understanding of Russia. Remember, thinking back to Peter, one of Peter's greatest skills and characteristics that really helped him in being such a successful and effective ruler was he had a pulse on Russia. He understood Russia. He knew what was going on in Russia. Catherine's going to be able to do the same thing, and that just shows her brilliance and her effectiveness. All right, let's continue, ladies and gentlemen. Now, during her time, ladies and gentlemen, there is going to be a massive serf uprising during her reign. This is going to be led by Pugachev, who's a Cossack soldier, and he's going to demand an end to serfdom, taxes, army service for the serfs, and we're going to see just the mass murder of landlords, nobles, all over parts of Russia. And eventually Pugachev will be captured and executed. However, this is going to have a dramatic effect on Catherine, and she is going to react very strongly to this. Okay, it made her nervous. And think about this, ladies and gentlemen, how we've seen this previously with some of our other monarchs. We've seen this with Peter, with the Streltsky and the Boyars. We've seen this with the Fronde, with Louis XIV, right? We're going to see, when we see massive revolts and rebellions like this that are largely unsuccessful, the monarchs will have a really harsh reaction, and Catherine will as well. All right, let's talk about this, okay? Now, that Pugachev rebellion, ladies and gentlemen, really kind of illustrated how tenuous and how fragile her reign was. So, what's she going to do? Well, she is going to retaliate with that rebellion by giving even more rights and power to the nobility, okay? She's going to put most local offices in the hands of the nobles, all right? And she's actually going to extend and give the nobles absolute control over their serfs. She's going to extend serfdom to new areas, including the Ukraine. She in 1785, she is going to free the nobles forever of taxes and state services. And a lot of the privileges that they're going to be getting from Catherine are going to be issued in this charter of the nobility. Let's make sure we highlight that. And so under Catherine, ladies and gentlemen, this is really important for us to understand, is that we're going to see nobles reach really an apex of their power, a height and position of power that they have never reached before, while the serfs are going to be worse off than ever before. Okay, and again, this kind of illustrates, ladies and gentlemen, one of the great ironies of Catherine the Great's rule is that while she knew that Russia was backwards and that Russia needs help to improve, and she's trying to modernize it, much like Peter, she's actually kind of going the opposite direction by as illustrated with serfdom, by not helping her serfs and helping her nobles. So she's really kind of being hypocritical to her advancement of Russia. Okay, let's continue. All right, let's talk about some of her reforms. Okay, similar to Peter the Great, Catherine was a lover of Western culture, and she's going to import that Western culture into Russia. A great example of that is by her wanting to speak French in her court. She's going to bring architects, artists, musicians, and writers to Russia to spread culture. She's going to bring about educational reform, and she's going to support more of private education, private schools. I forgot to write schools. Sorry about that. And we're going to see the number of books published annually increase during her reign, and we're going to see a school for noble girls founded. So she's going to start to support more private education and educational on the whole. All right. Legally, she's going to restrict the practice of torture, and religiously, she's going to allow for limited religious toleration. All right, she's going to grant the Jews some equality, stop persecuting some of the old believers of the Greek Orthodox Church. But as we can see, ladies and gentlemen, she's not going to make some drastic changes that we had seen with Joseph or Frederick. Okay. All right. On a foreign policy level, Catherine's going to make some very, very, very important moves. She's going to gain territory from the Ottoman Empire in the Crimea. She wanted another warm water port that's going to allow Russia to have more influence in trade with a navy. Okay, very important. Remember, if we think back to Peter the Great, that warm water port of St. Petersburg. She's also going to begin a conquest of the Caucasus region in the Middle East, and we'll see the importance of that, especially in World War II. That will be a land rich in natural resources of oil and fossil fuel. And we're also going to see her participate in the Partitions of Poland, where they annexed Polish territory multiple times in the 1700s, in 1772, 93, and 95. And we'll see. So Russia's going to gain a lot of territory in the east. And here is the Crimea that I was referencing before. That's going to allow them to have that warm water port, travel through this area right here and eventually into the Mediterranean. But we can see the Partitions of Poland here. Prussia's going to gain a lot of the territory in the north. All right. See Austria gain territory from this, ladies and gentlemen, and we will see Russia gain territory from this. All right. All right. And we can see Russia is going to expand quite a bit during this time under Catherine. Let's continue. All right. Here's some pictures of Catherine. Let's talk about some of the effects of the Enlightenment and end this lecture, ladies and gentlemen. The Enlightenment effects are very important. It's going to help facilitate the emergence of a secular worldview. We are going to see from the Enlightenment and from the scientific revolution massive changes about how people perceive the world. We're going to be seeing an industrial revolution. We are going to be seeing an agricultural revolution. So we're going to see a more secular world starting to arise. We're seeing enlightened despots. Perhaps one of the biggest effects of the Enlightenment, ladies and gentlemen, that I can't emphasize enough is we're going to see revolution come from this, okay? The American Revolution, but more importantly for our class, when it comes to the context of European history, the French Revolution, which is going to be wild, which I'll be lecturing on after chapters 7 and 8, which are already uploaded. We're also going to start to see educational reform, ladies and gentlemen. Educational reform is going to be quite important. That print culture is going to facilitate more of a desire and a curiosity for education. And in the 1800s, we're going to start to see education rise and eventually become compulsory. All right, we're going to see the growth of capitalism. Capitalism is going to blow up. We're going to see that with the Industrial Revolution. Industrialization is starting. That's talked about in chapter 7. And so we're going to see some dramatic effects, ladies and gentlemen, of the Enlightenment. Okay. Now, I want to end this lecture, ladies and gentlemen, talking about the idea of liberalism. We're going to start getting into, especially after the rise of the French Revolution and Napoleon, the isms, okay? Conservatism, socialism, liberalism, nationalism, all right? Communism, all right? The Enlightenment, ladies and gentlemen, is considered classical liberalism. And we're going to start to define liberalism versus conservatism. All right, the Enlightenment is considered classical liberalism. Now, this is the political outgrowth of the Enlightenment, and it's really important that as we see this notion of liberty and equality, that doesn't necessarily equate to democracy. All right, doesn't necessarily equate to democracy. So if you see anything on the AP examiners, anything referencing, ladies and gentlemen, the Enlightenment, classical liberalism, it's referring to the Enlightenment. Okay, and that definition of liberalism will change as we get through the 1800s and even the 1900s. Okay, very important for us. Now, classical liberalism refers to the Enlightenment, so liberty, okay, equality, natural rights. All right, it's referring to laissez-faire, belief through education. Okay. That's what it's referring to. But it's really important to understand that this Enlightenment, and we've talked about this, not necessarily referring to democracy. Some of our thinkers were more democratic, like Rousseau and Montesquieu, but not all of them. Okay, so the classical liberalism is referring to the Enlightenment: liberty, equality, natural rights, constitutionalism, all right, capitalism, laissez-faire, economics, religious toleration, freedom of speech and press, just punishment for crimes. Okay. And so that is really important for us to make that distinction and understand that. Okay? All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for Chapter 9. I have one more lecture just on the art of this that I will put up, and then we will be done with our Chapter 9 lecture. Thank you so much, y'all.